Is there a good reason, a really good reason, to believe that Jesus came back from the dead? Our video maker today seems to think so, and I've agreed to throw in my 2 cents, and I'm going to be fair about this, but I'm not pulling my punches. I really wouldn't be getting my hopes up though, but I'm going to give this an open mind and then explain why I'm likely not going to be impressed. I could be wrong though, so let's go see. This one was a special request by the video maker, the Epitome Ministry. So if you see them down in the comments, say thank you for putting this out there. If I remember right, I had made a video, I don't even remember what video it was, but they came into the comments and asked if I would do one of theirs. They even picked the specific video, which is this one, and therefore here that is. Fair warning, I'm not pulling any punches just because the creator might be here, but I don't do that. It's nothing personal, I just don't have double standards. Also, I'm sorry it took so long. I told the Epitome Ministry that I had like a 2-month backlog, but it's actually longer than that since I have at least a month worth of videos written up front, and in this case, I had some longer videos to get out, which you've seen in the last couple of weeks. So this is going to be out there a very long time after the request came in, and I'm sorry, but it wasn't on purpose. So anyhow, let's get to it. I hope this is good.
Today I want to give you one really good reason to believe that the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth happened.
Great, hit us with it. Now, I will say right now that I doubt this because, at least in my experience, which, keep in mind, that doesn't really mean anything in this case, but in my experience, I have seen exactly 6 seconds of this video so far, and in my experience, when the religious say things like this, it's only because they're smuggling in all of their theology and beliefs, whereas I'm not. I have nothing to smuggle in, and I am not going to take the things that you present, presumably because of course I haven't seen it yet, but I'm not going to take any of those things on faith. I am not going to believe it because you haven't supported it. Now, if he supports it, that's great, but I'm not holding my breath on that. This is really what I see a lot are the people who will say something and then in the back of their minds, they're just assuming the stuff in the Bible and the stuff that their church says and the stuff they read in books. They just assume all that's true, even though none of it has been rationally justified. I am not going to accept your unsupported, unjustified, unproven preconceptions. Just getting that out of the way up front. So what is your reason? Let's hear it.
Let's get into it. So, what is my one really good reason to believe the resurrection happened? It's the very fact that Christianity still exists today.
That's a really terrible reason. Lots of religions exist today. Does that mean that everything in their foundational myths and beliefs actually happened? Because I don't think you're going to agree. Did Muhammad actually split the moon in half just because Islam is still around today? That does not make that true, does it, though? So I'm not going to take your claim seriously if you're not going to take theirs. And I could go through tons of other examples of religions that are still hanging around out there, yet non-believers are going to reject all of the magical claims their theology makes because they are irrational. And let's be honest, the things the Christians say, they're irrational too. Then there's the big problem where you haven't actually proven anything. Just because you really like the idea, that doesn't make the idea true. Just because a lot of people really like the idea, that doesn't make it true either. You have to have actual evidential support, and sadly for you, you don't have a thing. Now, like I said, if he supports it, fantastic, but I've never seen a theist be able to do it yet. If you had a thing, you wouldn't need faith. You just trot that thing out. You wouldn't have a belief in it. You'd just be able to show that it actually happened. And I don't believe for a second that you can do that. So if this is what you're so proud of, then I'm just going to shake my head and walk away. Maybe he'll explain better, I don't know. So let's just keep going.
And I know you might be thinking, how is that a good reason to believe that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the grave?
I think I already went into that because it really is a terrible reason. It doesn't matter what you want to be true. It matters what you can demonstrate to actually be true and be reasonable using evidence to back it up. And sadly for the religious, they simply have nothing but wishful thinking and blind faith. I assume there's got to be more to it than this, though, since he's still got another 8.5 minutes of video. So let's get back to it and see what he has to say. Keep in mind that I think he's smuggling his theology in because they all do it. The second that comes up, and I will be sure to point it out, but the second that comes up, we're going to have a serious discussion. He might have made the video for other believers, but he specifically asked me, a non-believer, to review it. So this might not be pretty. Let's see.
I want to give you 3 facts that will hopefully help support this claim. The first fact is that political, social, and religious movements were common at the time of Jesus.
They're common today. There has never been a time in human history when they weren't common. So what? This really reminds me of Christians who think that Matthew 24, 6 through 13 means something. There will be wars and rumors of wars. Yeah, but when was that not true? But we're hearing about wars right now, and that proves the Bible is true. Hardly. The Matsala rebellion in North Borneo, the Somaliland campaign in Ethiopia, War of the Golden Stool, the Zande resistance, Muhammad Umar Khan's rebellion, the Hamawan revolt, the Sudan revolt, the French conquest of Borneo, fighting in Java, an uprising in southwest Madagascar, the Shobak revolt. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, and those are just the wars in 1900, not the 1900s. That was one single year. And they're all like that. Somewhere there is always a war going on. Somewhere there are always rumors of wars going on. Just because you can read something into it, that doesn't mean that the Bible is worthwhile. That is not how this works.
And when their leaders were killed, the movements quickly dispersed and were never heard from again. And here are a few examples of this.
Before we get there, though, he is already clearly smuggling things into his assumptions. First off, he's assuming that Jesus ever existed at all, or that the stories in the Bible about Jesus are actually true. This is not externally defensible, because Jesus didn't actually start Christianity. Paul did. Paul ran around telling stories and converting people, and by the time Paul died, and we're not even sure who Paul was, because let's be honest, we have no external validation for Paul either, but there wasn't just one leader. By then, there were churches all over the place, each with their own leaders, and it didn't really matter what anyone believed, because everyone had their own take on the stories. Paul even said in his epistles to watch out for all the false leaders, because, that's been going on ever since. I think what he's trying to say, and he can certainly correct me if he'd like, but this is my take, is that a group like the Branch Davidians tend to go away after their charismatic leader dies. But in reality, the Branch Davidians, they're still out there, David Koresh or no. There are multiple groups out there right now that identify as Branch Davidian. Even if that's not exactly what he had in mind here, it still proves that even without a single leader, these things don't tend to just dry up and blow away if there are enough people with a committed faith behind it. So long as there are strong believers, they tend to stick around in one form or another.
Our first example is Judas of Galilee, who, alongside Zadok the Pharisee, started what is known as the Fourth Philosophy, or the Fourth Sect, which is more commonly referred to as the Zealots. They were Jewish nationalists who opposed giving taxes to Rome. After he was killed, the movement dissipated.
So, I've already given an example of one that didn't, and there are a ton of examples that I could provide. But you notice what he started with, not a religious movement, a political one. Political movements don't tend to be as fanatical as religious movements do, because once it becomes clear that the actual authorities can and will take you down, they tend to scatter because they're really after their own personal physical comfort, and they're not after something going on in heaven some other time. Religion tends to focus on benefits in the afterlife, whereas political movement tends to focus on benefits in the here and now. That's why the two are simply not comparable. Oh, and you want another example of a dead cult leader that didn't kill the cult? Ryuho Okawa, who started the Japanese cult Happy Science. He died in 2009, and Happy Science is still going strong. Now, he wasn't killed or anything, but the loss of the leader didn't remotely end the movement. And I can keep going with this too, because there are tons of examples. We'll see if there's a need moving forward for another couple, but I don't want to bore people.
Next is Theudas. He claimed to be a prophet who could divide the Jordan River. Josephus tells us that many were misled by him, and his movement was quickly quenched whenever the Romans had him beheaded.
I guess he wants to keep going. How about Abdullah al-Mahdi Bila, and I'm sorry, I probably massacred that, but he was head of a Muslim sect back in the 8th century CE. He declared himself to be the Mahdi, which is kind of a Muslim equivalent of a messiah of sorts. He died in 934 CE after being imprisoned by Saladin, who took over Egypt, the stronghold of the cult, and officially ended the caliphate. The beliefs still exist today and are a sub-branch of Shia Islam. Playing these games isn't going to get you anywhere because I have just as many examples as you do, probably more.
The next guy, I'm probably going to butcher his name. I'm going to pronounce it Athronges. Athronges led the Jews in a rebellion against Archelaus and the Romans that lasted about 2 years. He was eventually killed alongside his brothers, and just like the others, his movement was quenched.
Again, that's a political, not a religious movement. He was opposed to the Romans under Herod Archelaus, and we mostly know about him through the writings of Josephus. Interestingly, though, we don't actually know what happened to Athrons. Josephus wrote about the fate of his 4 brothers, but is completely silent on Athrons himself. It's not at all surprising that a political movement fell apart after their entire leadership was wiped out, but it's not impressive enough for a counterexample since I think I've already made my point.
Next is Simon of Perea. He too led military conquests against the Romans. According to Josephus, he burned down the royal palace at Jericho, set fire to many other of the king's houses in several places in the country, utterly destroying them.
Still political, not religious. Hopefully he's not just going to do the entire video of examples of other people who did stuff, because none of that actually demonstrates that Jesus came back from the dead. This is just a distraction, not evidence that Jesus ever rose. That's unfortunately very common with the religious, because they don't actually have any real evidence. They just have stuff that they really like the sound of. But that doesn't mean anything. You need that evidence, and you don't have it. I probably should at least fast forward through any other examples, because I think we've beat this horse to death at this point. I guess we'll have to see how it goes. We could go on all day trading examples back and forth, but none of that would show that Jesus ever did anything of substance. And isn't that the whole point of this video? The only reason to believe that Jesus came back from the dead is if you have evidence that Jesus came back from the dead. Not arguments, not wishes and dreams, not "it sounds good to me," but evidence. So let's get to that, because nothing less will do.
But he was quickly overtaken by Herod's infantry and beheaded. There's also some speculation around Simon of Perea that he claimed to be the Messiah.
Well, that's just additional information, so I'm going to let that one go. And claiming to be the Messiah was pretty common back in the day. It was a quick way to get attention for your cause, and Judas of Galilee, no, not that Judas, a different one, Theudas, Simon of Perea, and Athrons, they all gave it a shot in the first century. It's never really stopped, though. There are still people to this very day claiming to be messiahs among the Jews. Among the more recent were Moses Gibbery, who lived until 1985, who led a British-Israeli cult in the United States, and Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who lived until 1994, whose followers thought he was the Jewish Messiah. His cult is still out there today and growing. According to some followers, Schneerson never really died. He's just out there someplace. I don't know if it's in hiding, but he's just out there someplace still alive. This is the kind of thing that religion does to you. It makes you take all leave of your senses. I guess this is another case of a dead Messiah figure whose movement didn't end with his death. And in Schneerson's case, it only got larger.
And finally, in the 2nd century, we have Simon Bar Kokhba.
Okay, one last one. Seriously, after this, I'm done. But you notice that all of the examples he's giving, they're all political movements, not religious ones, right? I've already explained why that's a problem and why, ultimately, none of this matters at all. But sure, go ahead and get it out of your system, and I'll see you on the other side.
Who started what is known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt in 132 CE against the Roman Empire. He established a Jewish state for about 3 years before being killed by Roman troops, and many thought him to be the Messiah, including Rabbi Akiva, who was a prominent Jewish rabbi at the time.
That is all relatively accurate as far as it goes. Rabbi Akiva used a number of Bible verses claiming that they were prophecies of the coming Kokhba. You have to remember that in Jewish tradition, at least at the time, they saw the Messiah as someone who would come and save the Jews from the Romans, not as a spiritual leader. Certainly, nobody would have expected any of these examples to have come back from the dead or do miracles or anything like that. They were just human beings doing human being stuff, perhaps with the claimed approval of their imaginary friend in the sky, but these were not magical men doing magical things like Jesus turned out to be. So how does any of this actually support the miraculous resurrection of a failed apocalyptic preacher at the beginning of the 1st century CE? It doesn't. It doesn't do anything at all. It doesn't lend any credence to it whatsoever unless you embrace a whole bunch of unjustified, nonsensical beliefs first, which the religious have to do. But I'm not doing it, though. I'm waiting for evidence, which I don't think is forthcoming. Wonder why?
And after Bar Kokhba was killed, just like the others, his movement was quenched when the Romans really cracked down on the Jewish people. N.T. Wright adds, in the 1st century and the roughly 50 years around either side of it, we know of 10 or a dozen other Jewish messianic or quasi-messianic movements, and we know those movements came to an end with the violent death of the founder or the key figure.
Because they weren't religious movements. If you limit this to only religious movements, you get a very different story. Romans at the time worshipped their emperors as gods, which was really common throughout the ancient world. When those leaders died, their following didn't evaporate. People still believed. The same went for the worship of Egyptian pharaohs. The problem with all of his examples, one of the problems anyway, is that he's just describing cults of personality, not religious belief systems. Without the charismatic leaders, there was nothing left to do. The political movements just moved on to other charismatic leaders. Whereas the next guy that came along that said they'd take on the Roman Empire, the same kind of people just signed up there because they weren't really in it for the leader. They just wanted to get rid of Rome. That's not the case with Jesus or any of the examples that I've given. There, you had an entire belief system that didn't revolve only around the individual in question. You didn't need a physical Jesus to believe all the supernatural crap that Christianity claimed. Christianity transcended Jesus, just like Islam transcended Abdullah al-Mahdi Billah. You don't need the guy. You just need the belief. And that's why this point is all so pointless. He doesn't understand what's actually going on.
And when that happened, if you were a follower of that movement, you had a choice: either give up the movement or find a new Messiah. Fascinatingly, the Jewish groups that followed Jesus of Nazareth didn't do either of those things. They continued the movement, and they said, astonishingly, that the recently crucified Jesus was the Messiah.
Somebody remind me, have we done any N.T. Wright stuff around here? I mean, directly. I know he's been mentioned in passing, but if anyone has a good article or a video on Wright, let me know. Maybe I'll do it. However, what he read just reinforces my point. The political movements needed the charismatic leader, and once that leader was gone, people had to move on, either to another leader somewhere else or just into oblivion. That's not how religion works, though, since the religion isn't really about the leader. The leader is just a figurehead. The actual meat of the beliefs have very little to do with the leader at all. And that's why all of his examples fail, because there you need the guy, whereas with religion, the guy is largely irrelevant. The guy is just somebody you look at and say, there's the guy, and then you go off and believe all kinds of other stuff on your own. It's why most theists have faith in faith, not faith in anything demonstrably real. That's just what they want to believe. But wanting to believe is simply not enough.
And interestingly enough, if you read the Gospels, you'll see that the Jesus movement was going to suffer a similar fate. In Luke 24, Jesus is speaking to two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and he said, "What are these words you're exchanging with one another as you're walking?" And they came to a stop, looking sad. One of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, "Are you possibly the only one living near Jerusalem who does not know about the things that happened in these days?"
Now, normally, I would just fast forward through Bible verses because they don't really mean a thing. My book says a thing is irrelevant. These are just stories, not demonstrable truths. This is another example of beliefs being smuggled in because they just really want to believe. Here, though, I'm going to let it slide because it doesn't matter if it ever happened or is just a story thrown in because it makes a point. We see the religious pulling that one all the time, right? A very long time ago now, we did a video of a young Christian who claimed that he converted a lady to Christ in a liquor store. And let me know if you still remember that one because I hardly remember it myself. But he was just standing there outside the liquor store, but he didn't put her on camera. He didn't interview her. We have no reason whatsoever to believe any of it. It was just a just so story told because it made the tale more attractive to his intended religious audience. But that doesn't make any of it true. And that's why I reject this stuff, because I need the actual justification, not the empty claims. The claims mean nothing. Only the facts do. So anyway, he was telling a story. Let's get back to that. I want to get through his first point, if I can, before we wrap up for the week.
And he said to them, "What sort of things?" And they said to him, "Those about Jesus the Nazarene, who proved to be a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it is now the third day since all these things happened."
And if you read the stories, there were a lot of people who were expecting Jesus to be a political leader, not a spiritual one. In fact, a lot of the stories in the Gospels are just a means to salvage the Jesus tales from oblivion, since he supposedly died without accomplishing anything of any demonstrable merit. So they put a spin on it. But that's not what it really meant. And today, we're still dealing with the results of those bald rationalizations. You've got to remember that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses to anything. They were written by people with the benefit, in big air quotes, of decades of a giant game of telephone and wishful thinking that no one can actually demonstrate is true. These are folk tales. Nothing more. It's interpretation of stories that were commonplace in the culture, but that doesn't mean that any of it actually happened. The religious just assume it because they have a vested emotional interest in doing so. But I don't have that problem. I see it as it actually seems to be, as most secular Bible scholars see it. We don't have that indoctrinated mind poisoning hanging around like a millstone around our necks. That's why none of this is at all impressive to people who don't already have that faith. This shouldn't be impressive to anyone. And for anyone who's actually impressed, you need to take a solid look at it because you're doing intelligence wrong.
So, we have all these messianic or quasi-messianic movements that came to an end with the death of their leader. And it appears the Jesus movement was going to suffer a similar fate. But what changed?
The believers rewrote their expectations. Instead of being a political movement, it morphed into a theological one. Well, he didn't really come to save you from the Romans. He came to save you from your sins. The stories that were written down about it had a distinctly theological bent. But that doesn't mean anything. It just makes it an interesting claim. But it doesn't make any of it real. So we're right back where we started, with none of this actually proving that Jesus rose from the dead, or let's be honest, existed at all, because this isn't about having a really good reason to believe in the resurrection. It is, as with most apologist attempts, just a bald rationalization to get them where they really want to go. Now, I'm going to arbitrarily stop right here and pick up with his next words in the next video. Sometimes you just have to do that because these things will get too long otherwise. I was hoping for a more definitive stopping point, but we're getting long and I have to consider where to cut this for future videos, so I'm just making an executive decision here and stopping it right here because. Don't worry, we'll come back with his very next word, but I wanted to ask what you thought so far. Has this been a worthwhile point? I don't think so, but I've had plenty of time to explain why, so now is your chance. Let me know down in the comments what you think. And maybe the epitome will come along and throw in his views, I don't know. So far, this has just not been impressive because it doesn't actually demonstrate anything remotely related to the supposed resurrection of Jesus. Well, this stuff over there, if you squint just right and haul in all your religious preconceptions along with you, well, it just might make you think you have a good reason. But you don't. You just don't. You only have faith. And faith doesn't mean anything. The only good reason to believe in the resurrection would be evidence. And sadly, the religious just don't have any. That's why they have to play these games. It's why they just have to play make-believe. It's why they have to baldly rationalize. And I'm sorry, but this is never going to impress anyone who isn't also hauling around all that baggage. The failure is theirs. It always has been, and it always will be. What else is new? See you next time. Is there a good reason to think Christianity is true? One theist thinks there is, but we're halfway through that, and so far, it's just not looking good. However, things can change, and I'm happy to give it another go. So, can we find a good reason, a convincing reason, a rational reason, a reason actually backed up by anything remotely evidential, to think that Christianity is true and Jesus rose from the dead? Let's go see. Let's finish up our evaluation of the Epitome's video, actually recommended to me by the creator, for which I am very thankful. Thank you for sending this in. If any other theists want me to take a critical look at their videos, just post a direct link to them in the comments and I'll just add it to the list. Now, I can't guarantee that I'll do all of them, and there is a considerable lead time, but I will do my best to give it a gander and maybe it'll show up on the channel. So with that out of the way, let's dive right back in.
If If you were to ask the followers of Jesus, they would have all given you the same answer, that he rose from the dead.
You have absolutely no way of knowing that. You are just shoving words into their mouths. This, I find, is very common with people pushing a particular narrative, and it happens today. But everybody thinks this. No, they don't. Go ask them. This is not about actual truth. This is about agenda. It's about spin. You have to remember that the followers of Jesus were a very, very, very small number of people at the time. Christianity didn't become important until the time of Constantine, hundreds of years later. So if you were going to go out and ask that question of your average man on the street in the first half of the first century Jerusalem, that is not the answer that you'd be getting, because Christianity was at best a minor cult following a supposed failed apocalyptic preacher at best. Most likely, very few people had ever heard of him at all and didn't know anything about Christianity. So I don't buy it. Not for a second.
This brings us to our second fact, which is the first century conception of resurrection for the Jewish people. The Jews believed that there would be one bodily resurrection at the end of the world.
Yes, they did. And when this Jesus character, which we can't even prove ever existed at all, but let's just assume it for the sake of argument, and you know how much I hate that term, but if this Jesus guy got hung on a stick by the Romans, then his followers had to move fast and try to explain, in the light of the things that the Jews already believed, why Jesus was still supposedly their guy. And that's why Matthew in particular, or whoever wrote Matthew, since we know it was written anonymously, but he had to go back into the Jewish scriptures and reinterpret things that were never intended to be prophetic as prophecies that he could twist to seemingly refer to Jesus. That's what actually went on. The Jews were expecting a great king or a military leader that would come and save them from their troubles, and at that time that was the Roman occupation. They did not expect someone who would die and rise again from the dead. So whoever wrote the Gospels, and we still don't know who any of those people were, they had to create the impression that this fit in with what the Jews already believed. Unfortunately, they did so very badly, because most Jews didn't convert to Christianity, even to this day.
To summarize their view, they believed that when you died, you remained in the grave until the end of the world, where your soul would return to your body and you would have a new bodily life.
Yup, and Christianity, they just made up a different paradigm. All religions do this. Joseph Smith came up with the idea that Mormons would go to heaven and become gods in their own right if they followed the precepts of Mormonism. It doesn't matter where he got the idea. He could have just made it up. It could have come to him in a dream. We'll never know. But he just took one view of Christianity, he added in his own ideas, and he came up with an entirely new religion, just like Paul primarily did with Judaism when he heavily modified the fledgling Christianity into something that I guess he liked better. Therefore, whoever wrote the Gospels, they further came up with new ideas that they meant to appeal to the existing Jews, and it worked to some degree, although not, as I already said, for the vast majority of Jews who just rejected it even to this day. This is exactly how religions evolve. It's not truth, it's delusion and dishonesty.
This helps us understand Martha's response to Jesus in John chapter 11. If you don't remember, Lazarus, her brother, had been dead for 4 days. In verse 23 and 24, we get this exchange. Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise from the dead." And Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day."
This is all just mythology, and I don't tend to go through Bible readings because the Bible has never been justified to be demonstrably accurate at all in pretty much anything, especially when you get to the supernatural stories. I honestly don't know that this is at all worthwhile, But we'll see just how long it goes on. I might shift into fast forward mode if I feel it's getting too preachy and off topic. This is just the gospel writer, whoever the hell they were, trying to shift expectations from what the Jews already believed to what the Christians were trying to push. That doesn't prove anything other than that humans are manipulative. I mean, what the hell else is new?
It's also important to mention that there were a lot of questions and debates around this doctrine around the first century. People were asking if you were going to be married in heaven, if your new body was going to be corruptible or incorruptible, and things like this.
Some of those debates are still going on today, but it's all really irrelevant since there's no reason whatsoever to think that there is a heaven or an afterlife in the first place. That's where the religious really have problems because their doctrines are based on wishful thinking, not demonstrable fact. I don't care what you want to happen. I don't care what anyone says. I care what they can prove and provide demonstrable evidence for, and that's where they really fail because they can't prove any of it. They don't have any evidence for any of it. They can just make empty assertions. They can just make claims without support that are conveniently placed beyond any ability for us to verify. Nobody has ever demonstrably come back from the dead to tell us what's on the other side. So all the claims in the world mean absolutely nothing. That's why they have to take it all on faith. And I'm sorry, but faith is completely useless.
And it was also a tertiary doctrine, meaning that it wasn't a very important one. The Jewish people's main doctrine and focus was that God had revealed the Torah to them, and they were supposed to be a light to the world because of this revelation that they had received.
And as I said, they were doing a really bad job of it. You have to remember that everything the Jews were doing, and are still doing to this day, were just hand-me-downs. Their God was borrowed, in the Joseph Campbell style, from other pantheons. If they're supposed to be a light to the world, then why do they spend so much time getting abused? Why do they spend so much time throughout history getting their asses kicked? It really sounds like a gigantic set of excuses for why things aren't going well for the Jews. Maybe, just maybe, they're just a shit culture. Who knows? Because at the end of the day, the Jews have never done anything particularly of note as a religion. Individual people? Sure. The Jewish religion? Well, it's always been a niche belief and it always will be. That is not very impressive at all.
So, how did the topic of resurrection go from a tertiary doctrine before the time of Christ to the very center of Christian theology in as little as 20 years after Christ in Paul's letters?
It's actually very common in other neighboring religions from the region. We can find references in Egyptian and Canaanite writings which speak of the dying and rising gods such as Osiris and Baal. The ancient Greeks generally spoke of immortality, but we can still find references to men and women who rose from the dead and were made physically immortal in the process. You can find resurrections among the Dharmic religions, and in Buddhism and Hinduism, reincarnation is very, very common among those peoples. Because all of these religions were known in the region at the time. So it's not at all surprising that such a belief might be adopted into this new burgeoning religion, especially given that their leader, whether he ever existed or not, was said to be put to death. It's not a very convincing claim if your Messiah is dead, so they had to find a way to bring him back. And that was just make shit up.
Every early Christian document, creed, and church father centered their teaching around bodily resurrection. This sudden shift in focus demands an explanation.
And I've already given one. You have to remember that Christianity was just a cultic offshoot of Judaism, and if we look at other cultic offshoots of Christianity, this exact same thing happens. You can look at Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness theology, and it is quite different than mainstream Christianity, to the point that a lot of Christians simply refuse to accept them as just another denomination of their own religion. However, we can look at some other more severe offshoots. The Branch Davidians, which started off as a radical sect of Seventh-day Adventists, or the People's Temple, started by Jim Jones, and you'll find that they have one thing in common: a charismatic leader that suddenly makes changes and inspires people to follow him. This happens outside of Christianity as well. There is Osho, a cult in India led by Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. Some have made the argument that Baha'i is an outgrowth of Islam. There's a lot of examples that we can come up with, so Christianity is hardly alone. New cultic offshoots appear all the time in any major religion, and even a lot of minor ones. Christianity just isn't special.
And here's my contention. I contend that in order to explain this sudden change in the minds of this early Christian movement on the topic of resurrection, without appealing to the bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, you will have to contrive a narrative that neglects some of the data we have, or you'll posit some data which we have no evidence for, or you'll tell a self-contradictory story while trying to be consistent with the data.
Except I've already done that without any of the above. Because he, like a lot of theists, has to insist that their stories are true without providing any evidence whatsoever that their stories are actually true. We can go right back to Elvis because we know that people were seeing Elvis immediately after his burial in 1977. The very first sighting that we have any records for is the day after he died at the Memphis International Airport, where a man that looked like Elvis gave the name John Burroughs, which is the name that Elvis used when he was booking hotels. There were sightings in Michigan in the 1980s, and even multiple sightings at the opening of Legoland in 1999. Although there, the park admits that they did hire Elvis impersonators, but many people still firmly believe that Elvis's death in 1977 was a hoax. And of course, the Weekly World News ran stories of Elvis sightings for years. The simple fact is, people tell stories. We know that post-bereavement hallucinations are a thing. People can think that they saw a loved one that has been lost, even if they really didn't. None of this means anything, especially given the fact that you can't even prove that Jesus existed at all, or that the stories told in the Bible, all written by anonymous non-eyewitnesses, mean anything whatsoever. You have to assume a whole lot of stuff that is clearly not in evidence. Thanks, Allison, for that. Sorry, I'm just not impressed.
This contention does contain an implicit assertion that the resurrection hypothesis is the most parsimonious with the data that we have, and is the least ad hoc of our options.
And you're wrong, because miracle claims will never be most in line with other information. Never. You have to take that part on faith, and faith doesn't mean anything. Faith doesn't get you anywhere. Your faith doesn't convince anybody else that your faith is true. It doesn't matter what you really want to be true, only what is demonstrably true matters, and you have no objective demonstration for anything. Mistakes, lies, and hallucinations, things for which we have actual evidence, are a much better explanation and always will be. I'm sorry, that just doesn't fly, except in the minds of people who are already desperate to believe stuff that they've just been brainwashed into believing.
Our third and final fact that makes it utterly surprising that Christianity still exists today is the fact that Christians were horribly tortured and even killed for the claim that Jesus bodily rose from the dead.
Some of that is true. Some of it is just assumption. A lot of the claims about the supposed disciples are just church tradition with no actual data to back it up. Besides, it doesn't really matter because we can point to other religions where the exact same thing happens. Just because you are convinced of a thing, that doesn't make that thing real. The 9/11 hijackers all died because they believed in Islam. But that doesn't mean that Islam is true. Dying for a lie happens all the time. 39 people died in Heaven's Gate suicide pacts because they really believed that a UFO was coming to take them away in the tail of the Hale-Bopp comet. That doesn't make it true. It doesn't matter how strongly you believe a thing. Your conviction doesn't prove the veracity of your beliefs. Then there's like the good walkers who were part of a cult in northern Italy in the 16th and 17th centuries. They believed they could astrally project out of their bodies and fight evil witches in order to guarantee a fruitful harvest in the fields. Of course, they were persecuted by the Catholics and often murdered because that's kind of what Christians did. Did those people die for a lie? Apparently so. We can go on and on and on and on and on with examples of people who died for things that they firmly believed, things I'm sure this guy would claim were false, and there were no double standards there at all. So either crop-destroying witches actually exist, or his own claims are complete bunk. Pick one.
I actually have an entire series on early Christian persecution and why I think it happened, and there's good evidence for it. You can click on the card above to get a fuller and deeper dive into that topic.
No one doubts that Christians were persecuted or that Christians persecuted other religions, because they absolutely did. That's a matter of established history. It doesn't prove that any of the things that Christians or other religions that were persecuted by Christianity, or any other religions who have ever been persecuted or have persecuted others, that doesn't demonstrate that any of the things that they believe, any of the things that they've had faith in, were actually true. That's the whole point. If someone claimed to believe that invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies were real, and they were willing to die for that belief, or they were willing to dedicate their lives to preaching that belief, or whatever, that doesn't prove that that belief is true. And I've seen theists making all kinds of claims that nobody would ever do this or that or whatever if it wasn't all true, and that still doesn't make the claims true. It's all a matter of faith, and the truth is what matters, and the truth isn't proven by the belief, only by the evidence, and I'm sorry, but this guy has no actual evidence to support any of the claims he's making. He's really just making the argument from popularity or the argument from consequences, because there's a lot of fallacious ways to get there, but none of it actually demonstrates anything. None of it actually provides any evidence that any of it is true. And that's the problem.
For this video, I simply want to point out that people will not suffer and die for views that they know are false.
That's demonstrably wrong. There are plenty of cases that we could bring up where people died for something that they knew was wrong, but that they thought would benefit someone else. I mean, how many parents have taken the blame for crimes committed by their children, claiming that they did it when their children didn't? But yeah, that's not really where he's going, so let's just skip over that. What he's really missing here is that they didn't have to know that it was a lie. They just had to believe that it's the truth. Believing that it's the truth doesn't make it the truth. We can point out tons and tons and tons of examples here as well, and in fact, I've already done so. Just because you believe it, that doesn't make it true. So let's just assume for the sake of argument that all of this stuff is true, that there was a Jesus, that he was crucified by the Romans, that there were disciples, yada, yada, yada. The disciples really believed that Jesus was magic. There are numerous examples of cults where that was true, and people have died for those beliefs, as we've already said. Does that mean that those beliefs were factually correct? No, absolutely not. It only means that they believed it. You still have all of your work ahead of you if you want to get from, well, they believed a thing, to that thing that they believed actually happened. And how do you propose to do that? Because I'm sorry, but I'm just not seeing any of it.
The earliest apostles would know whether or not they were lying about the resurrection.
Except you have no demonstrable accounts from the earliest apostles. The Gospels were all written anonymously by people who clearly were not eyewitnesses. Actual eyewitnesses wouldn't need to copy from other people's work like the Gospel writers did. Over 90% of the contents of Matthew is copied straight from Mark. Luke copies more than 50% of his own content from Mark, with another large amount coming from Matthew. Paul was never an eyewitness to anything by his own admission. He just had a drug trip on the road to Damascus. So you have no demonstrable eyewitness accounts for anything, anywhere. You cannot prove that anyone actually saw anything. This is all just stories, and you are taking your own blind faith as evidence that any of it is actually true. And I'm sorry, that's just not how this works.
And the fact that there is no evidence of any kind that the apostles ever recanted, and we know that early Christians were persecuted and killed for their beliefs, this gives us incredibly strong reasons to believe that Christianity is in fact true.
No, that's just laughable. First off, you can't say that none of them recanted. Just because you don't have evidence that they did, that doesn't mean they didn't. That's not how logic works. Secondly, in a lot of what he's saying, that's just church traditions. It's stories that the church tells because the church had a vested interest in telling those stories. The church has a vested financial interest in keeping itself going. So, my church said a thing, that doesn't mean that the thing that your church said is actually true. This is just an assertion that you can't back up at all. And before you say, but you can't prove they lied, I don't have to. I'm not the one asserting that they told the truth. You are. The burden of proof is 100% on your shoulders. You have to prove that these tales happened as described, and you just can't do that. It doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter what you have faith in. It matters what you can demonstrate. So you'd better get to work. Third, though, even if everything said was true, let's just let them have it for the moment, it still proves nothing about the veracity of Christianity because their beliefs don't prove truth. It only proves that they believed it, and they could be wrong. This is just leaping to conclusions that are not justified by the facts. Well, there must have been a UFO in that comet's tail because the Heaven's Gate members, they wouldn't die for a lie, would they? It really is that stupid. It gets you absolutely nowhere.
It also goes a long way in explaining why Christianity still exists today.
Nope, that was Constantine. Christianity was a pathetic little cult until Constantine mandated it throughout the most powerful empire of the day. Then it got carried on by the swords and shields of every Roman soldier throughout the known world, followed closely by the missionaries, who took advantage of the newly conquered people by insisting that they not only adopt Roman rule, but Roman religion as well. And that's why Christianity survived. If Constantine's mother and wife hadn't converted, then it's unlikely that we'd see Christianity as more than a historical curiosity today. The truth of it had nothing to do with it in any way, shape, or form. It just didn't.
The earliest followers watched their leaders, the founders of the movement, go to their graves, proclaiming this message to be true, that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead, which gave them the courage to carry on their legacy in the face of the persecution that they too would face.
That's all just tales the church tells you because they've got their hands out for your money. It's an emotional appeal to keep butts in seats and the collection plates moving. It's an example of people who believed stuff, who went out and did things motivated by those beliefs. But we have many, many, many examples of that across the world in many religions, and that doesn't prove that those religions were true, any more than it proves that yours was true. This is just an example of human irrationality. Humans doing dumb stuff for dumb reasons because they're running on pure fifis and faith and nothing else. And that is not something to be proud of. And I'm not sure why you are.
And that's going to sum up my case for why I believe the very existence of Christianity today serves as good evidence for the bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth.
And it failed miserably. This has all been, I really, really, really like the mythology, so I'm going to pretend it means something because it really makes me feel good to think it's true. But that means absolutely nothing. You actually have to demonstrate with evidence that any of this stuff is real, and you just can't. The best you can do is show that people were dumb enough to believe it. But that doesn't prove any of it really happened. You are vastly overstating your case. There's a standard of evidence that you need to meet, and you're not even trying. This is just leaping to conclusions that are not justified by the facts, and sorry, but that is not remotely impressive. The only thing that the continued existence of the church proves is that the church has survived. By that token, Islam has to be right too, right? It's still out there, and it's growing, unlike Christianity, which is hemorrhaging members left and right, or Hinduism, which has been around for about 3,000 years. Jainism has been around as long as Judaism. Does that make that true? Because I really don't think you're going to agree, are you? After that, he just goes back and recaps, but I think we're going to skip it because we've already torn his entire premise apart end to end. This is really the problem with all of the apologists who desperately try to overreach their own claims. They get to a certain point, some earlier than others, some later, and then they just make a bum rush for the end zone screaming, "I was right all along!" No, you actually have to defend each of these points rationally. You have to be able to provide evidence for every step in the process. They know they can't do that. That's the problem. So they go as far as they can. They make a bunch of unsupported assertions, not defended by any concrete data, and then they say, well, I was right all along because that's what they really want to be true, when they are anything but. You can't just assert stuff. You can't just assume stuff. You can't just believe. You have to be able to prove. You have to be able to provide evidence. And they absolutely can't do any of it. That's why it's all just a gigantic argument from ignorance. I don't get it, therefore God. But that doesn't mean anything. You have to prove God first, not assert God, not assume God, not have faith in God. Prove it with evidence every single step of the way. This is why Christianity exists, was destined to fail, because the existence of a belief doesn't prove the truthfulness of the claims that belief system makes. It's the truth that matters, and you need evidence to demonstrate that truth. Now go back to square one and try again. Come back when you have the evidence that you need to prove that any of the things you believe are actually true. If you want me to evaluate your next effort, just let me know, because I'm always happy to oblige. Anyway, that was it. I wanted to thank the Epitome one last time for asking me to take this on. It was fun, even if it didn't work out so well for his side. So, what do you think? Did he have any worthwhile points? Let us all know down in the comments. This is really why the religious fail, because they're so desperate to get to something that they find emotionally comforting that they're willing to skip a lot of important steps along the way. And I'm just pointing out all of the things that they missed and all of the options they're ignoring, because I don't have a vested interest in their religion like they do. That's why it's so important to be able to step back and look at these things dispassionately. That's where you figure out where you're going wrong. You need to stop caring where you end up, so long as where you end up is rationally and evidentially supported. So long as where you end up is the truth, the demonstrable truth. And in this case, it's just not. But we can reset and try again, right? So I encourage the Epitome to go and do just that. Good luck in your future endeavors. Try to learn from your mistakes and improve. And I'll see you all next time.